All right, so people are coming in. Welcome, folks. I am not able to see who's coming in, but I'm able to see numbers, and it looks like we're up to 16. So what I'll do is I'll wait just a couple of minutes before we begin. Let folks have a chance to come on in. My goodness. I'm just loving the backgrounds of Radha, Crisosto, and then Dave with his books. You know, Dave got rid of all of his books when he moved to Tasmania, and now I see that they're just replacing them all.
They're piling up again.
Did you hear about the new Auden too?
I've got it.
Of course you do.
I'm reviewing it for the Hudson Review. It's a hell of a thing.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Hi, Julianza. Let's see. Art Good Times is here. Mark Irwin is here. Welcome, Mark.
Hey.
Old friend of James and Julie. Okay. Anybody else who wants to say hello in the chat, then at least I know who's here. This is one of the things that is difficult with webinars rather than Zooms, is that if you just can't see who's here. It's kind of a blind situation. So, oh, Deborah Weller's here. Yay. Hi, Deb. Welcome. A bit tricky. Glad to be here. Mark, hello. Do you remember me from Poetry West? Did I ever get pictures to you? Okay, so let's see. Hey, beautiful ones. Looks like Kirsten's here. Danny Rose, and hey from Danny. Hello from Fort Morgan, Brenda Wildrick. All right, so we are filling up. It's good to see. Thanks for checking in so I have an idea who's here. And let's see. Awesome. All right. Well, goodness. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Here we are. Thank you all for being here. For those who don't know me, I'm Wendy Videlock, and I'm coming to you from the western slope of the Colorado Rockies. In fact, we're so far west in Colorado that we're practically Utah. The land that surrounds us is part of who we are. It reflects our histories. So in that vein, I'd like to start by acknowledging that this land is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, and Ute tribes. The Utes originally comprised 13 tribal bands, and each lived within or inhabited an area of Colorado, as well as parts of what we now know as Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. The original peoples of Colorado have maintained their presence here for more than 18,000 years. In this way, we acknowledge the difficult history of the land and of the people to whom it rightfully belongs. I'd also like to thank Beth Franklin of the Colorado Poets Center for so generously sponsoring this 3-part, maybe 4-part Zoom series. This is the second in the series. I'd like to thank all of you in our audience, without whom we would just be talking to ourselves. And a big thanks to our panelists who have agreed to share their knowledge and wisdom and their works, and who have agreed to allow me to pick their brains and their storytelling hearts tonight. We'll probably go about an hour and 15 minutes tonight, and I'd like to get in questions from the audience, so I'm going to be checking the chat. Anytime that anybody has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to keep up with that. Before I introduce our special guests, I'd like to start with a few words on storytelling, and I hope to add a few more awesome quotes about storytelling from the audience or from our panelists. So think about that as I'm rattling off these good words. Muriel Rukeyser tells us the universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories. Kipling tells us if history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. From Annette Simmons, we get the telling and hearing of stories is a bonding ritual that breaks through illusions of separateness and activates a deep sense of our collective interdependence. Ben Okri says stories can conquer fear by making the heart bigger. I love that one. Dana Joy, our old friend, says, we are the species Homo fabuli, the storytelling creature. And I think this one is actually a Dave Mason quote. The implication is that the human brain is a storytelling one. Does that sound like you, Dave?
Maybe me quoting somebody else, I don't know.
Right. And to shamelessly quote myself, there are few words more sublime than once upon a time. And so, Mark from Salida, welcome. All right, without further ado, we are fortunate to have with us tonight three wonderful narrative or storytelling poets. We've got our old friend, Dave Mason, who for many years taught at Colorado College and is coming to us tonight from his new home in Tasmania. Dave served as Colorado Poet Laureate of Colorado. What years was that, Dave?
2010 to 2014.
Okay. Dave grew up in Bellingham and in Washington, has lived in many parts of the world, including Greece, where he served, and Colorado, where he served as Poet Laureate. His books of poems include The Buried Houses, The Country I Remember, and Arrivals. His upcoming book is Pacific Light. His verse novel, Ludlow, was named Best Poetry Book of the Year by Contemporary Poetry Review and the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. Ludlow is the story of immigrant miners who were basically massacred here in Colorado in the small town of Trinidad. And it was also featured on PBS NewsHour. He's written a memoir and 4 collections of essays. His works have appeared in all kinds of periodicals. His last book was The Sound, New and Selected Poems. And essays appearing in 2018 are Incarnation and Metamorphosis, Can Literature Change Us? He is all over the map, switching genres a little bit too naturally than I can understand. We also have Radha Marcum, whose work is new to me, and I'm very excited to introduce her to our audience tonight. She is also tends towards the narrative lyric. And what's interesting about all 3 of our panelists is that, you know, in the age where the lyric poem is sort of dominant, I mean, if you open any book of literature, any poetry, you know, anthologies, it's going to be like 99% lyric poems. And so we really want to explore this, this whole idea of storytelling and myth making in poetry tonight. So Radha's work is rooted in ecological, social, and personal landscapes of the American West. Her collection, Bloodline, received the 2018 New Mexico Book Award in Poetry, and her poems appear widely in journals like Pleiades, Gulf Coast, Field, West Branch, Split Rock Review, the Bellingham Review, Poetry Northwest. She lives in Colorado, where she teaches at the Lighthouse Writers Workshop. And she has a newsletter called, which I've been exploring and is wonderful, called Poet to Poet, which explores the process of writing and publishing poetry. And it's free to subscribe to it. So maybe you can put that in the chat. And then finally, but not least, we've got Crisosto Apache. He's originally from Mescalero, New Mexico, on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. He's also Chiricahua, Apache, and Diné Navajo of the Salt Clan, born to the towering House Clan. He earned his MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe in New Mexico. Apache's debut collection, Genesis, with a line through it, 2018, stems from the vestiges of memory and cultural identity of a self-emergence as language, body, and cosmology. Speaking my language. His poems have appeared in Yellow Medicine Review, Denver Quarterly, Hawaii Review, Red Ink, Cream, City Review, Plume Anthology, and Commonplace, the Journal of American Life, and photographer Christopher Felver's book, Tending the Fire, Native Voices and Portraits. Apache lives in the Denver metro area with Apache's spouse, where Apache teaches writing at various colleges and continues his advocacy work for the Native American LGBTQ two-spirit identity. So with all of that, let us begin. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to sort of introduce themselves with a poem of their own. And if you'd like to give us a brief story about how you came to poetry, and specifically how you came to writing storytelling in poetry. Most people choose prose for storytelling. So if you want to give a little background on that, that would be great too. Let's start with you, Dave.
Sure. Well, I started storytelling poetry a long time ago, but I started by writing prose fiction. And I was always writing poems, and I always felt sort of guided by the sound that was involved in poetry, and sound guiding the hand, sound guiding the line and the image. And voices were a huge part of what I was doing. And so when I was trying to write fiction, one of the problems I had was that I just completely failed at writing autobiographical fiction. There was always this cipher in the middle of the story, this thing that was an authorial stand-in that never became a character.
Mm.
So I remember in particular in my early 20s trying to write about people I'd known in Alaska. And I decided to write from the point of view of a young woman. And that seemed to make it happen, to make it a little bit more real. So I've been appropriating voices, stealing voices all my life, unapologetically. And when I wrote lyric poetry, there were so many pressures under which I was writing that it was really, really hard for me to make things grounded and real. So I began to write in the voices of other people. And I remember particularly writing in the voice of an old woman who had raised my brothers and me. I came from a rather complicated family background. And she's a woman who later died at about the age of 103 or so, marvelous woman. We called her Auntie Wright. And she was, the widow of a lumberjack who I'd known as a little boy. And he, in fact, was the first person I knew who died. And it was the first shock of death I had in my life. That this old guy I used to see playing solitaire in the kitchen was no longer around. And anyway, I wrote in the voice of Nellie Wright. I wrote a short story, and editors were giving me compliments on it, but not accepting it. And then I noticed that some other poets of my generation were writing stories in verse. And then I realized, well, Robert Frost did this, and Robinson Jeffers did this, and what the hell, let me try this. So I took that short story and I just hammered it into a kind of pentameter verse and kind of a dialect voice of her voice speaking to me. And I actually used a story from somebody else, not related to her at all, and brought those stories together in this piece that was called Black and Peaches. And that was the beginning of it for me. My first book has 3 sizable narrative poems in it. One in the voice of a middle-aged woman who's leading tours through Greece. She's based on somebody I knew, and one of the characters in that book is maybe a little bit like me, this kid seen objectively from a distance. And then there's a story called Spoonin', which I imagine that many readers have thought was autobiographical, but it's not. It's a first-person narration about a boy who meets a silent film movie star. And that never happened to me. Nothing of the sort happened to me. But what I did was I used the story as a way of trying to write about the milieu where I grew up, the town in the Pacific Northwest where I grew up. The family in the poem is entirely fictional and all that stuff. So it became a big part of what I do. And then, I wrote longer narrative poems, The Country I Remember, Ludlow, etc. Now, what I'm going to do is I think principally it was important to me not to feel limited by my own personal experience. Partly because as a writer, I was better able to make experience real if it wasn't just my own experience or narrowly focused on my own experience. I know this is a controversial thing these days, but I believe in the possibilities involved in this. I've also written lyric poetry all my life, and I've written dramatic poetry, opera libretti. I've tried to write plays, et cetera, et cetera. I'm even working on a prose novel, so I'm trying my hand at everything. The poem I'm going to read is the most recent of the poems I've got today, and it's from my new book, Pacific Light, which I think is dominated by lyric poems, but even there's a storytelling element. And this one, kind of ironically, is called The End of Stories. And I guess you could say it's autobiographical, except that even here, I'm not sure I've got the facts right. So what happens is I sort of give myself permission to turn everything into story. And if that means that the facts aren't literally true, as one of my relatives might remember them, that's all right with me if I can make the poem work in some way. So it's a relatively short poem called The End of Stories. I used to know his name, the fisherman who chainsawed a skylight in my mother's roof. Not your ideal tenant, she dryly said. I knew he dealt to high school kids and led the life of someone people thought was cool, a name at parties where I never went. So that was who he was, a leaky roof, one legendary season on a boat and final buying trip to Mexico, where all the stories thinned to silence or fell out headless on a desert road. New stories rose, and someone else's weed clouded our nights until the fire went out. I couldn't stand the stuff and gave it up, resealed the skylight in my mother's roof, and slept beneath it and the summer moon and all the lunacy the country offered. The end of stories comes for everyone, but not for stories. They go on living out somewhere under a light of their own.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, and one of the hallmarks of your work, Dave, seems to be that this idea that we can't really rely on memory anyway. That's always sort of a recurring in the works, and it's so true. We can't rely on our memories or anybody else's. And
yeah, I want to be really careful that I'm not one of those people who believes there's no such thing as truth. I think that's a very serious proposition.
Tricky. Yeah.
I just believe that what we know is limited and that our humility about what we know is important.
Yeah.
If memory is the mother of the muses, Mnemosyne, if memory is the mother of poetry, and I believe she is, then the fact that we don't know the absolute truth of our memories is an important part of where we are in that imaginal space. And we have to respect the fluidity, the adaptability of memory and imagination. I think it's a beautiful thing about who we are as people. I don't think it's a scary thing.
Well, it can be maddening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. It's lovely. Radha, let's move to you.
Dave, that was such a lovely poem. So I'm sad to have to follow this, but so just a little bit of background on how I came to write. Wendy, as you're calling it narrative poetry, I grew up with a folk singer father and a painter mother. You know, they did other things for their professions, but nevertheless, this was, you know, sort of the environment in which I grew up. And as I came into, you know, I was always deeply into words and literature and finding a way through the world through language. And as I developed, you know, as a child, I really became much more drawn to the lyric impulse than to the storytelling, you know, the sort of narrative fiction means of finding a way through language. For me, writing this book, Bloodline, that came about through a long series of experiments in sort of going into the landscapes that I grew up in as a child. So New Mexico, Colorado, I also spent time in as a child, but I grew up in California. And to me, my sense of self, my sense of who I was in the world was really deeply tied to the landscapes of New Mexico. My grandfather was a physicist on the Manhattan Project. And so I think also when we grow up around something like that, where, you know, his work was classified, there's a desire, right? There's a sense that the narrative that we've inherited is inadequate to really understand ourselves. Additionally, I think when we look at the landscape anywhere in the West, we realize that the, you know, similarly, the stories that we've inherited from the culture at large are very inadequate. There's a lot of erasure. There's a lot of not saying what's actually happened in the place or giving the simple story. And so I think for me, it's that impulse to honor the complexity of place that comes into this narrative melding with a lyric impulse. So I actually don't consider myself a narrative poet, believe it or not, but you know, I would say that I'm first and foremost a more of a songwriter at heart. So I will read a quick poem called Oppenheimer's Dog, and this was really this was the genesis for the book. This poem came before all the other poems, and I think you'll hear in it sort of the threads of the landscape and the family stories and you know, the seed kernel of the book. So Oppenheimer's Dog. Oppenheimer's dog barks through all eternity, through pinion wind and ether, barks its piercing harmonics from down the dark block, buries its bark in my grandmother, my mother, me, until memory splits its casing, thrusts the old sound bone, regret, into the world once again. With my instrument, I pick it up, the inevitable. Chases the wind through dry creek beds and ochre canyons, on the mesas and in bare abandoned cubas. Shakes the soundpost of the family's cello, leaning closet dark in its sack. Transmits its song nevertheless. Barks at the stars as over decades regret condenses to a procession of wind-lifted tears, flat black seeds barking from the waterless yucca.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
it's lovely. Yeah, I'm really struck by this grounding that the dog brings to this, and it's sort of loosely storytelling, and I think it's a really nice blend of storytelling and the lyric, because we're not being told in linear fashion. It's sort of like time is sort of all over the place here, and that old sound bone regret, and you know, and how that really, you know, echoes, and how intimate, you know, it feels. So we go from this big historical event, to this really sort of personal taking in of history, really. So it really occurred to me reading the works of all three of you, how many different ways in there are to telling stories. Like so many times it's some object or something that sort of grounds us so that we can sort of hold on to it, through the story. So that was lovely. Thanks so much. Let's move on to you, Crisosto.
Okay. I just want to say thanks again for having me here tonight. This idea of story, I think it's very important because I think for me, culturally, that's a point of view that I've always been exposed to, mostly because of like who I am, what many of my culture is about, is this idea of telling stories, and also about this idea of keeping memory. Earlier, my education, being the first person to graduate high school and pursue an education, I started off as a painter when I entered college. And I didn't really think that I would ever become a writer because that was like the last thing on my mind. When I was younger, I did a lot of reading. I read a lot of books. I spent a lot of time in the library at school. But in my spare time, I would paint most of the time, which is what got me into college. But while my first year in college, I was a pro, and I thank Arthur Z for turning me into the writer that I am today, because he is highly responsible for a lot of the things that he taught me about writing, which would be the second semester of my first year. I changed from being a painter to then studying more about writing, and I've not put it down since. And this is like at the beginning of the 1990s. Some of the things that I look at in terms of my work, when I started out, I was very interested in some of the avant-garde kinds of writing that dealt a lot with conceptual ideas and imagery. But then later on, the more I started reading other works, I started to look at some of the construction of the poems, and did notice that there is a structure toward a narrative kind of construction. So I started to take that and start to use that in a lot of my writing. Which later led into the writing that I'm doing now. My current book that is going to be released later this year has a lot of that tied into it. The book is called Ghost Word, but it's a response to a Japanese writer, a modernist Japanese writer from the 20s. Akutagawa was a primary writer in the time, and it was known for a lot of the writings that he's done. He's known for being the prominent short story writer of the time. And so the work that I've done in Ghost Word was like a kind of a personal response to his last written work, which was called A Fool's Life. And the story behind The Fool's Life is kind of tragic, because he wrote that manuscript as he committed suicide. And in that manuscript, there was 53 entries that was finalized in that manuscript. And Arthur Z is the one that turned me on to this writer. So a lot of Akutagawa's work was out of print for quite some time. And it wasn't until recent years I was able to find a lot of his work in print, especially the Fool's Life. I carried around a carbon copy of this book, and just flip through it from time to time. And I was really captivated by these what I'm calling poetic vignettes. It really got me to start thinking about how Akutagawa was trying to tell his life in these 53 short entries. So I started to really ponder about that, and maybe take that as a moment to sort of explore how I can use that as sort of an adaptation to tell a story. And many of the poems in Ghost Word are sort of a response to that idea of storytelling, and going back to this idea of memory. A lot of my writing, I think, goes back to this idea of like sort of investigating persona, also working with imagery, and looking at some of the background of information that comes from some of the influences such as history and mythology, or even some of the stories that I grew up with, and how can I use these as tools to tell a story and sort of kind of revitalize the telling of that story. But some of the information in terms of my own writing, as far as persona, I take on the persona of like my mother. I also try to put myself into other people's perspectives outside of my own. There's a poem that is in this collection that I dedicated to one of my uncles, because it was a story that my mother would tell me in a lot of conversations that we had. He was a Vietnam vet. She remembers growing up with him, but then when he went to war and came back, she told me that he was never the same person. So I would think about those concepts, about this idea of persona, and even some of the ideas of the stories that my mom would tell me, and how could I use that to sort of capture moments. And I think Akutagawa's inspiration about how he sort of did that in these vignettes kind of gave me that idea that I could take these moments and sort of spur these stories that are just momentary. So I'm going to start off with one of the poems from that collection. And again, these are sort of reference to the 53 entries that he had done. So they're kind of mirroring each piece. So this one is called 19 Flight, which is taken from Akutagawa's 19 Man-Made Wings. Number 19, Flight. Quote, unfolding these man-made wings, easily he glided up into the sky, unquote. Eagle volunteers to carry all my prayers to the sun as an equal to a father, a deity, or a god, redacted. On his ascent, he undergoes the dense force of sun's rays. Eagle returns to earth with singed wings. In his reoccurring ascension, Eagle finds himself looking into the sun. Eagle places his right wing over his eyes, blocking the sun's rays. Although the sun warms his feathers, Eagle can never find himself inside the rays of its illumination, and never carrying my undeserving prayers upward. So again, that was a response to Akutagawa's man-made wings. In that particular vignette, Akutagawa is questioning this idea of enlightenment, which he references Anatole France and Rousseau, the philosophers. So that's really what I kind of pondered when I was trying to respond to that particular vignette.
Yeah, it's really striking piece. Well, first, it resonates in so many different ways. But then as it closes, I just love this. Eagle can never find himself inside the rays of its illumination. Because, like Western sort of tradition is always about like illuminating and understanding and like the scientific kind of reason, when so much is mysterious, that we just really can't sort of comprehend. So it kind of took me in all kinds of different directions with that ending, which seemed to sort of go in its own direction, whereas what came before it kind of felt like that it was, taking from many different sort of traditions. And from what I understand about Akutagawa's work, he too was sort of like, collage work, taking a little bit from, this part of history, a little bit from this culture and a little bit from that, and then sort of reinventing. Do you feel that you are doing that too?
Yes, like I said, I really borrow a lot of inspiration from many of the stories that I grew up with, a lot of coyote stories, a lot of creation stories, and living stories, personal history and experience. A lot of conversations that I've had with my mother talk about all these kinds of stories and even the historical perspective that come through my history.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a never-ending sort of exploration, you know. I mean, what's interesting as you talk about playing with persona and, you know, going into, you know, other voices and how, you know, like I think it's Alicia Stallings who says, you know, I find myself pretty boring. You know, you're like, you know, I can only go so far with my own experiences. I wanted to, Mark says, memory is the belly of the imagination, St. Augustine. I like that one. So let's do another round, and let's follow the same kind of format where I sort of throw out a question. You can, you know, kind of respond to the question and then give us another poem. So if you can talk a little bit about that sort of narrative storytelling voice and how, you know, sometimes you're sort of escaping, you know, identity. Sometimes you're sort of discovering it. Sometimes we're just really trying to sort of open up that whole idea of identity. So if you can talk about specifically about the storytelling voice, because so many of us, we associate storytelling with somebody who told us stories in our childhood, and how much it goes back to that sort of very primal understanding that a story helps us make sense of ourselves in a way that really nothing else does. And another thing that we might sort of touch on is something that Radha was talking about, which is what she called the sort of hidden narrative, you know, because a lot of the stories that we're drawn to, that we come back to over and over again, they're not necessarily happy stories. And so we come back to the tragedies, the horrors that humans, you know, impose upon one another. And that in this way, that we all sort of need to find some sort of glimmering light within, you know, those kinds of stories. And that, you know, so how you sort of, you know, kind of measure that out, you know, because all three of you are dealing with very difficult histories. You know, whether it's, you know, Ludlow or The Collector's Tale or, you know, Hiroshima and, you know, like, you know, Native history, all of this, there's like so much to explore and so much of it is so difficult. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then you can each give us another poem too, and we'll start with Dave again.
Yeah, I did a thing I do too often, which is I forgot to acknowledge where I am when I spoke before. I grew up with Lummi, Nooksack, and Makah people in Washington State. Both my parents worked on reservations. And I'm now on an island, the island state of Australia, that's famous for having sort of massacred all indigenous people in the 19th century. That's not true, as it turns out. There are lots of indigenous people still here. But I don't mean in saying that to diminish what happened here. It was a very, very terrible, terrible time and a terrible thing. So I should acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Moluccardy people and nearby the Nuenini people of Bruny Island out that way. And I should pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And I think this is really important. The first time I ever heard anybody doing this sort of thing was in Australia before it became a sort of popular thing to do in America. Australia's got its own difficult history to acknowledge. And I think on the whole, it's doing a fair job of acknowledging it, which is also to recognize how many problems there still are. But that's really important to me, to be in a place, no matter where we are on Earth, and to know the stories of that place as best you can. That's always been important to me. When I taught in Ireland, I knew Irish people who could tell you every story of every hill and stream around them, going back to mythological times, and bring those stories right up to the present century or up to the 20th century with the killings in the Civil War and all that sort of thing. To me, that is a huge part of this life of ours, of living in this veil of stories. The other question you raised, Wendy, was about who's telling the story? What is the storytelling voice? And I've tried many different voices, first person, third person, all sorts of kinds of storytelling voices, first person voices alternating in time, etc. But I thought I'd read a little poem, a short poem that's in the selected poems about the teller. And this is, again, based on something I heard. And let me give you an example of how when we hear a story, that story changes every time we tell it. When I first published this poem, I referred to a character in the poem as Eskimo. And I published the poem with that word. And then I realized that was a dumb mistake. He's Inuit, and it doesn't wreck the texture of the poem at all for me to use that word. So now I've got it scratched out in my book and I've got the word Inuit written in. But this is the kind of thing that happens to us whenever we publish anything or write anything. We change in relation to it. So here it is, this story. And here, the reason I wanted to tell this story was that it's just a remarkable story. It's a hell of a story. You could write a novel. Somebody should write a novel. And I ended up writing a sonnet, a little tiny poem of 14 lines. And the question still is, who's telling the story? The teller. He told me, maybe 30 years ago, he'd met a raw-boned Inuit named Jack while filming polar bears on an ice floe. Jack went out fishing in his sealskin kayak, but the current carried him so far off course that when a Russian freighter rescued him, they signed him as a mate to Singapore. 5 years at sea it took to get back home. The year an Englishman gave him his name. The year of hustling on a Bali beach. The year of opium in Vietnam. The year he pined for snow. The year he searched for any vessel that would turn toward Nome. The man who told me, I tell you, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the thing about, stories and ballads and, they're just like, we don't know. But the story survives and changes, as, the editing that continues on and on. So I'm always interested in, the literary devices or techniques. And I love listing and litanies, but I love this, 5 years at sea it took to get back home. And then, those 5 years describing each one, and that so much goes into such a small space about this mysterious gentleman that we know as Jack. Somebody decided to call him Jack.
An Englishman.
And yes, and it says so much about, the very nature of stories is that, almost all of the old ballads that we have are written by anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Brothers Grimm, they didn't make those stories up. they had been told those stories. Those stories had been told for a very long time before they came along and, created anthologies of them. So this is one of the things that I really appreciate about your approach to storytelling is that there's always this aspect of that it came from another source. We're not quite sure, there's always, an acknowledgement of that.
I love the story within a story device. You know,
Mm,
I love those fictions of people
yeah,
like Conrad. I've always loved that stuff.
yeah, it really works for me too. When it doesn't work, it's horrible.
Yeah.
You just, all you want is to get back to the main, get back to the story. Okay, let's move on to Radha.
This is such an interesting question about the voice, the speaker in these narrative works. I have always been really suspicious of the pronoun I, and I tend to very much shy away from that. And particularly when looking at something historical, or, even just being in a place where you recognize there are so many perspectives on what happened before that happened, what the earth did before that happened. And
Right.
it's so layered, right? So to have a first person narrative through something that immense feels, there's something off about that for me. Equally, I think I'm suspicious of that third person omniscient, I'm going to tell you how it was, sort of that epic voice equally feels suspicious to me. So I don't know that I have, an exact answer for how I've navigated that, other than to say that I've adopted, I think, a very fluid stance to what's first person, what's clearly my experience of something, but allowing sort of a very large lens in which other things are coming into that space of a personal eye. So, and you mentioned hidden narratives. I love this idea of, there are hidden narratives everywhere we look, in any space that we enter into, in any landscape in which we are. There's always sort of these narratives that have been either purposefully or just accidentally lost in the chaos of our contemporary culture. Of course, dominant narratives tend to, like I said earlier, kind of put your attention somewhere else or erase this fact that, they don't want you to focus on too much. So to me, I think part of what I feel is my duty or my calling with poetry is to just press that a little bit and say, hey, actually, if we just look, there are things that we will notice in any space. So I'll just read a really quick poem called Hidden Narrative. And, this relates to the World War II theme. I actually wrote it, though, during COVID, when I happened to be looking at some paintings that are owned by the Denver Art Museum. And it's based on a painting. It's a watercolor that was painted in 1943, and it's untitled, but it's by a Japanese artist, Kakunen Tsuroka, and he was an American citizen born in Japan. So I'll read the poem, Hidden Narrative. With ink swirled from inkstone, pine, soot, tendon, bone, and a big cloud brush, the artist frees flushed hills, borderless clouds, a few dark shrubs like spilled tea. Then with a wolf hair brush, tip precise as the T at the end of interment, sets the skeletal mesquite twisting.
Yeah, this one knocked me down when you sent it to me. It's just so powerful and so for me, so unexpected, that penultimate line, which just shifts everything. And I think it really does also fall into this this category of the hidden narrative, within, in this case, a simple watercolor painting. And there's something so, this is one of the things I think, one of the reasons I think that poets turn to verse for storytelling is that you can pack such a punch with so much restraint. Like this is a poem of restraint. It just has this one small moment, where everything turns on, this another historical aspect of things. And it just sort of, it doesn't try to explain anything. It doesn't try to go, it's just this very brief, just you get this little moment where you're not allowed to look away. That's how it strikes me. Very, very powerful. I think it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines. Yeah. So thank you for that. All right, Crisosto.
Okay. So yes, this idea of who is telling the story, the voice or the speaker, I think I really try to take a look at that when I do write a piece, because it really makes a huge difference in how the poem is delivered when you do tell a story within the poem. One of the things that I definitely look at when I'm writing a poem is the content, and I pay specific attention to the place, try to make some association to that, and try to be as specific as I can when I'm focused on the one poem. And one of the things I try to think about in writing some of my poetry recently is this idea of pivoting the story so that you're able to sort of, guide the reader in the direction that you want them and have an unexpected ending that I think can be controlled sometimes, but I think sometimes very difficult to do that. And but I think as far as experimentation, those are some of the things that I think about when I am writing poetry. Is like, how do I construct a poem so that it has all these elements that aren't going to steer the reader away from the writing, because I think story and the perspective is a huge part of that. And I did like the idea of what Radha said about the landscapes around us. There are moments that we're surrounded by stories. So this poem that I'm going to read is another poem from that collection, Ghost Word. And this one is responding to Akutagawa's number 12 that he calls Naval Base. And this one, I dedicated it to my uncle Edgar, and it's really I'm trying to get into his persona or his perspective. And again, these are from stories that my mother and I used to conversate around. The title of this poem is Crisosto, and Crisosto is a very specific place on my reservation, and it's kind of crazy. I mean, the reservation is about 300,000 acres. And there's a lot of various different places of the reservation that has very, very interesting names. And Crisosto is one of those places. And it's a place where I grew up, kind of in that area. There's another poem that's called Saltwell, which is another place in that same area that I grew up. So I find the names of the places on my reservation very interesting. Here's the poem. Number 12, Crisosto, for Ida Kluge. Quote, "The submarines inside was dim," unquote. Number 12, Naval Base. In my youth, I hitched a ride to San Diego, across chirping desert and distant night. I gazed upon a slow moving dark encasing a convex cerulean cavity. Each night I stood beneath the sky for hours, mesmerized at the perplexed reformatory of twinkling lights and broken glass fragments spreading against the glistening sunset. A faceless man behind a lost reflection of a glass at a drive-up window informs me. Too bad you know nothing about your past. How far will I walk against the night, conforming to a captivity I had never realized? Some years later, under the kitchen table, they all huddle as the rampage continues toward the back of the house. A clash of debris crashing from the other room recoils, and broken sounds escape the barricade of doors. All I remember is returning in 1970. All they remember is me sitting at the edge of my bed with the war still in my hands.
Wow. Yeah, so we go, I mean, it's so, this whole conversation about memory, all I remember is, all they remember is, it's just, it really is at the core of storytelling. And I think even sort of science fiction, is imbued with, memory that we can't get away from it. That's a powerful piece. I don't think you sent that one to me.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, sucker punch.
Sorry.
No, it's wonderful. Do you want to say anything more about that piece?
A lot of the writing that I've done, especially in this collection that I have, again, like I said, is, and I really appreciate my mother taking the time to sort of spend a lot of time with me right before she passed. And I had also had the opportunity of recording her when she was telling me these stories, because I really valued the idea that she placed on remembering history. She was really good at remembering all of our birth dates, all of the things that we did growing up, as infants to our adulthood, and there's a lot of various different stories that she would tell me. And I knew that was a very good opportunity for me to sort of take the time to record her, because for me, my memory really isn't as good as it used to be, but I would go back to some of the recordings and just kind of listen to her telling these stories. And this collection that I have that is coming out this year really focuses on that idea of memory and perspective. I'm trying to dedicate a lot of that to maybe a personal kind of experience. And I'm not really sure if I did that, but that's really a lot of what I think Akutagawa was trying to do in these moments of erasure that he focused on in this last collection of his, where I'm trying to focus on this idea of seeking and belonging.
Yeah, it's such a good observation. I come from a people who were, well, they say that you can't have a memory of something unless you have an emotional attachment to it. And it's taken me like this many years to realize that my family was very big on forgetting things. And that this is a technique that we have really perfected, that this is, you just don't want to be emotionally attached, because then you're going to remember it. And it's been like my whole life trying to shake that off. And also I think it's a cultural thing that we tend to, it's safer. It's more, we don't want to be uncomfortable. So did you say that you recorded your mom telling you these stories?
Yeah, I took the moment. I mean, I knew that every time we got together to have conversation, she was going to tell me a story. And so she saw me pull out my little recorder, put it there. We just had this kind of organic conversation and not really realizing, the recorder is going. So, and I do. I know, I definitely appreciate those moments of, and for me, that's one of the more valuable things that I have in terms of a possession.
Dave?
Yeah, Crisosto, I just want to honor what you're saying about your mother. And that kind of recording is gold. It's a gold mine. And I did record my mother telling stories. Unfortunately, they were so dark that they precipitated a relapse for her. And it was like a total disaster. And, and I no longer have that tape. But that stuff is really, really, really important. Listening to the old people all my life. I've been somebody who listened to the old people talk. And that is just fantastic stuff. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, it totally is.
Yeah, I think we need to I mean, I feel that, the last couple of years of my dad's life, I kept asking him to tell me his stories and he just couldn't go there. There was such a block. And I just thought, my goodness, what a tragedy, that he didn't remember, coming to this country, that he didn't remember his father, that he, even if it was very dark history, but that it was just gone, that, he just couldn't access it. And it really seemed to me that it was one of those moments where I thought, this is not just my father. This is a cultural, maybe a human, I don't know. Maybe this is why we're so drawn to storytelling, is because there's another aspect of humanity, which is about just let's not go there. So let's do another round and have each of you share, like there are some longer pieces that both Dave and Crisosto sent that maybe you could do, excerpts from. And if we can talk a little bit this time about, well, this is a big subject, but creation stories. I think it was Ursula Le Guin who did a story about a planet of peoples who were told that they had always been the peaceful ones, that they had been sort of like creating peace between other, peoples, that they always stepped in and were sort of neutral, and that they had never had a violent history. And in the course of the story, they come to realize that that was all a big whitewash, that they had actually been as violent as all the other peoples, but that for their entire existence, they had been a peaceful people because they thought they came from a peaceful people. From the time that they sort of put this false narrative out there, they began to see themselves as, the diplomatic ones, the ones who went in and did all this. And that as soon as they discovered that it had been a lie, they became just as violent as all others. And this is one of the things I find most fascinating about creation stories, is that I think that they really do create a philosophy. Like any creation story that, where the whatever it is comes from the sky tends to have a very different thing from a creation story where you rise up from the earth, and it really changes the philosophy of a culture. So if we can just touch on that, on sort of this idea of storytelling and creation stories, because in so many ways, almost all stories are like creation stories, so if we can just sort of touch on that and then share another piece with us. We'll start with Dave.
Yeah, I think creation stories come from an immersion in place and where you live. And I've always felt deeply, deeply, deeply connected to landscape and story. And to me, they've been inseparable, which makes it ironic to some degree that I've led such a peripatetic life, living all over the planet. But I've always felt rooted in one particular place with one particular tree, a cedar tree in the Pacific Northwest, and also in the stories of my Colorado family. There are two things I wanted to touch on, and I'm just going to read 4 stanzas from Ludlow to sort of illustrate it. One was another part of telling stories is how long it takes to tell the story. And we can't really deal with that because of our time element here. But poems have meaning in terms of duration, in terms of time. And a really short poem means in a different way than a really long poem means. And a long poem accumulates meaning in different ways and changes its meaning over time. So, Ludlow is a long poem. And what I did was I developed a storytelling voice that I thought of it almost like a camera that could step way back from the story and see the landscape in time and move about in time, move from 1910 to the 1970s, and move about in time and space, and move right in, zero in on one character, and move away and zero in on another character. And that was incredibly liberating for me So the passage I'm going to read is just very brief. It starts way back, looking at landscape. And then it zeroes in, it zooms into this little girl in the story who has just been orphaned. Her mother was Mexican and died of fever, and her father was Welsh and died in a mine accident, a mine explosion. And now the other immigrants around her are trying to decide what to do with this girl who they call La Huérfana, named after El Huérfano, a butte of rock in southern Colorado that you drive past on I-25 whenever you go, north and south along the Front Range, right? So tiny little passage, but here she is in an immigrant camp in about 1912, and what she's observing is observed out of this kind of crushing introspective state she's in, because her whole world has been destroyed. Out of the rock folds, the scrub, the deep sky. Out of the junipers that loosed the dark when the sun crept over the mountaintops. Out of the mouths and tipples of the mines where men still worked, inquest or no inquest, where coke ovens glowed a stone inferno. Out of the train that wailed to Trinidad and back to Denver with its load of news came the sound that was not a sound, a muted scratching for life. All day she watched the hens of mining families cluck about the houses, named them for the way they worried or bossed. One was Mrs. for her Scottish talent catching bugs on the ground. One Senora for the way she pushed the other hens about despite a tattered wing coyote plucked. And the old cock who croaked his song at sunrise was a Welshman for the way he tried to sing. Her playthings, better for not being people and being so much smaller when they died. Girls came by, showed her their stitched dolls. Boys looked over their shoulders, whispered among themselves. She heard them talking, breezes, hens, women. Whenever she passed the yards, their wash tubs, their bodies at work. She knows, said Mrs. She knows the rag, the blood. She's no too young for it. We've men who'd stoop to the wrong thing here. She isn't safe. And more she wouldn't hear, though it came at her in whispers from all sides, in the feeding and breeding and dying life of the camp. She watched as a woman scooped up a hen by the legs, stepped on its squawking head, and jerked. It's just a transitional moment in the poem, but it's part of her creation story in a way. All the people who are surrounding her, all the different voices surrounding her, all the different fates that might be confronting her as she's moving forward in life.
Yeah, and it really is cinematic. I mean, it feels like, zooming back out and then coming back in, and there does seem to be a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah, I loved writing it.
Yeah,
I felt intoxicated when I was writing that book because I
wow.
felt like I could go anywhere in time and space.
Wow.
It was flying.
That's the stuff right there. All right. Let's see. Let's move on to Radha.
I think this question of our creation stories is such a potent one for these times, right, that we live in, and of course with meditating on the project that was this that brought about the atomic age. There's some pretty deep creation story aspects to that. So to me, I think with the book, we inherit creation stories through religion, right? So Christianity for a lot of my ancestors, that's coming into contact with a new kind of creation storytelling, which is science. Science is a whole other way of really telling that creation story. I mean, these pictures that are coming from the James Webb telescope are blowing everybody's minds. It's another piece. It's another way of sort of reflecting on that creation story. But I think with all of those, there's a sense of again the inadequacy, right? So any one of them, any one of those perspectives, may or may not give us what we need to move forward in our life, given that there were 70,000 atomic bombs that were being, stored up to make ash of the earth at a certain point. So I'll read a little bit of this poem called Project Y. So Project Y was the name of the project that brought about the bombs that were dropped on Japan. And it's a section poem, so I'll just read a few sections. Impregnated with hematite, iron oxides, element Fe, the red mountains here were named Sangre de Cristo, blood of Christ. I know the road by heart, the white crosses of ordinary deaths marking the curves, atomic Los Alamos cemented in swerving rows on the Pajarito Little Bird Plateau. This long slope, Christ's lacerated shoulder, ends at the snowy lip of an ashen cup, the caldera of a collapsed volcano. We think we want it, the unbreakable, incorruptible, immobilizing science for a predictable outcome. No happenstance, but uncertainty conceives our shape and makes our unmaking. We are the glass blowers, the myth makers. At the height of production, 70,000 atomic bombs waited to make ash of the world. I stare into opaque rocks, decode odd notes, take broken and uncoiling shapes, the ghosts of photographic evidence, into the wet and changeable shapes of language. Like a pilgrim to nearby Chimayo, I travel here to ingest the earth, to contain sickness in a story. So it goes on, I won't keep going, but they're just a series of vignettes that reflect on different experiences of going and looking at the trinitite, right? The glass that was created by the explosion of the first atomic bombs in New Mexico. And my grandfather's picture in the book in the museum at Los Alamos, and all sorts of little pieces of evidence and pieces of stories that I'm trying to stitch together into a kind of, okay, this is maybe what I come from and I still don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, did your grandfather ever talk about that? Was he too filled with regret?
So I suspect he may have been, but because of the silence that was imposed on him around his work, he really never talked about his work.
Mm-hmm.
And then he, and the book goes into this, he suffered from Alzheimer's. And so there was another level of silence that entered with that disease.
Yeah. Yeah, which is where the storyteller comes in and tries to contain it all in a story. Because we think of Oppenheimer, but we don't think about all the others. There were teams, a lot of people. Yeah. More hidden narrative, going on there. That's such a powerful, this is one of the things about, humanity that we can't unknow. This is what we've created. Yeah. Thank you for that. Crisosto.
All right, I'm going to read this poem, which was inspired by one of Arthur Z's poems from his book, Quipu. It's the Didyma, section 10, part of that poem. But really the inspiration for this particular poem, it's a very long poem, so I'm probably just going to only read maybe part of the first page. It's a flood story, so it's kind of in conjunction with the flood story of the Bible in Genesis. But the Whirling Log story is a flood story where the people at the time were sort of given this prediction that a storm was coming and that it was going to flood the area. So they were encouraged to keep going up this very tall mountain, or this mountain, to reach the top. And when they got to the top, one of the members of the people cut down a large tree and made a canoe out of it. And as the water got to the very top, he pushed the tree into the water and started to float away, hoping that he would find another piece of land or other people to join back with. But as he was journeying into the water, he came across a huge whirlpool. And the person went into the whirlpool, and as he descended into that whirlpool, he ended up meeting with the holy people. And it was during that moment that the holy people gave this individual some holy songs and prayers that when he finished his travels, he would take back to the people. So during this moment, he ended up blacking out, and when he came back he ended up being on a beach and then traveled to find his people again, taking these songs and prayers with him. So this is kind of a crude summation of this story, but this poem of Thunderous Bloodstorms is kind of using that story as a reference. And this poem is from my first book, Genesis. After I read this, I can post a link where you can find this poem at, where it was published. A thunderous bloodstorm. The rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7, verse 12, crossed out. Dawn bleeds through a biosphere back to a beginning. Clouds gather from onyx and waterfall. In that beginning, she, he, our hands caress. In that beginning, she, he, we are meant to exist. In that beginning, she, he, our voice heaves immemorially. Blood-webbed eyes clamp down around fingers. Seams of sideway light filters through glass caps. Tireless legs climb up the white mountainside. Pervious clay mesh between toes and dermal ridges. Soluble spine hinders the exertion to higher ground. Tan liquid skirts channel continuous embankments. Slate slides underfoot, coursing downward, now and before. Top center veins mend through the reinforcement of ochre skin. Memories of mankind work in this way. Memory is skin, which is all our body. Memory is milk, which is all our feminine. Memory is a voice, which is all our masculine. Memory is a cradle, which is our born. Memory is a dead heap, which is our stolen. Memory is a body, which is our massacred. Memory is placental land, our Americas. Our memories will reach the mountaintop. Baptismal leaves rise rapidly, as it always has. Clad bone and flesh pour from basalt mouth cliffs. Dense clusters of by-the-water sailor jellyfish engorged with algae. A hollow tree trunk hastily purged somnolent vessel. Thunderous static charge trades tasks of inert limbs. Speckling granulate flouts outwards, coating white eyelids. Lightning edges surge through tangled fingers. Swollen arms grapple along a timber raft. A shallow stutter sets mucus currents floating slowly away. A whitewashed membrane collides into a small piece of island womb. Curtain flaps and suspended inside buoyant flux of cavity. Tight, ruddy skin ewers bobs effortlessly adjacent to widening legs. Stagnant waves balance through droplets as it always has. This beginning undulates toward a whirling abyss. And I'll just stop there. because it's an ongoing poem, and it's a poem sort of with these with this memory that sort of builds in its momentum towards the end of the poem, and it's like one full stanza, if you will.
Crisosto, I really like
Go ahead.
the sort of paratactic structure that builds into, where one thing happens, another thing happens, and so you have a lyric momentum to this, to a kind of list, but it also becomes narrative. It's a beautiful blending of lyric and narrative.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the idea behind this was to sort of look at this poem as a much larger scope than just myself. If I'm dealing with this idea of an emergent poem or story, because really a lot of creation stories are that. This is moments of immersion where people are kind of coming into a being or identity.
Yeah, it's so true. And it just builds and builds. The poem actually keeps going. I'm sorry we don't have time for more of it, but I just want to highlight where things really start to happen. Memory is skin, which is all our body. I mean, that's just insanely
And milk.
powerful. Yeah, memory is milk, which is our feminine. Memory is a voice, which is our masculine. Memory is a cradle, which is our born. It just builds and builds. Did you say this is from the last book?
Yes, Genesis Redacted. And I just posted the link in the chat.
Oh, okay, good. Oh, good. Yeah. So I'm happy to know this redacted. So when you have a line crossing through a word, you just, because I wondered how you were going to handle that as you were reading aloud.
Yeah, that's sort of, I mean, in my way of doing that, it's sort of like taking back something that we sort of associate with, and in this case, looking at the idea of Genesis being associated to the Bible, sort of an allusion to the Bible. But in my particular situation in this story, I sort of don't want that to be the association, but I use it kind of nonchalantly. So the crossway through is kind of like, and the kind of acknowledgement of taking something back that has done something or impacted something.
Yeah. Well, it's like anything. If we pretend like it's not there, then we're just, in suppression mode, repression mode, like we have to acknowledge this profound effect on all of us. Beth, why don't you come on in and say hello? I wish we had more time. This has been really, really exciting for me because the last couple of years I've been writing my own, sort of story, because I've always been such a lyric poet that I can, now I can, it's like a whole new muscle. So it's been really great to hear sort of the inner workings of how you go about this. And I just want to say again, a big thank you to Beth, who, I just so appreciate what you're doing with the Colorado Poets Center, and how it has just gone along with the changing times. And now we're zooming all over the place.
Thank you. This was really, really interesting. And this, Wendy, thank you for hosting it. It was a good selection of poets that brought different experiences to this topic of storytelling and poetry. And it is recorded. It will be in maybe a week or so posted on the Colorado Poets Center website. So thank you again, Dave and Crisosto, Radha, Wendy. Excellent work. Excellent, excellent, excellent.
Thanks so much, Beth.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to meet you.
All.
Okay.
Hey there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.